mess with me is that Blueface doesn't seem active in the child's life because of his disability. Hold on. So I said my son does not have a disability. He is developing at his own pace and hitting his milestones in his own timing. Every child...
Something unexpected just started taking over social media, and it's not another music drop, not another celebrity feud, and not the kind of story people were prepared for. A single comment from a church pastor has now exploded into a full online debate involving Chrisean and her son, with millions of people reacting, speculating, and trying to read between the lines of what was actually said, and what the internet thinks was said. And here's where it gets complicated. Because the original statement wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't even meant to go viral. But the internet did what it always does. It amplified it, clipped it, reframed it, and turned it into something completely different from its original context. Now timelines are flooded, comment sections are divided, and every platform is filled with people trying to piece together a situation that doesn't have a clear, confirmed direction. Some users believe the pastor's remarks were being misinterpreted. Others think there's a deeper concern being hinted at. And a large part of the audience is stuck in the middle, trying to figure out what's real, what's assumption, and what's just internet exaggeration. But what makes this situation even more intense is how fast it escalated. Within hours, the discussion moved from a single clip to full-scale reaction videos, breakdowns, and emotional debates across social media. And now the question everyone is asking is simple. Did the internet uncover a real concern being discussed publicly, or did it create a completely new narrative out of context? Because right now, there are more opinions than facts. And that alone is what's keeping this story alive. As the conversation spread across platforms, the situation began evolving in a way that nobody expected. What started as a short clip and a single statement quickly turned into a multi-layered online debate, with different audiences interpreting the same moment in completely different ways. And that's where things started to spiral. Because in the absence of clear context, the internet doesn't slow down, it fills in the gaps itself. Within hours, commentary pages began breaking down the pastor's words frame by frame. Every sentence was replayed, paused, and analyzed. But instead of reaching one shared understanding, the analysis only created more disagreement. Some viewers insisted the statement was being taken out of context entirely. They argued that people were reacting emotionally without understanding the full message or intention behind it. According to this group, the situation was being exaggerated simply because of who it involved and how quickly content spreads when a familiar name is attached. But another group saw it differently. They believed the fact that the pastor spoke publicly at all meant there was something worth paying attention to. Not necessarily something dramatic or confirmed, but something that had enough weight to spark discussion in the first place. And in their view, that alone justified the online reaction. Between these two extremes stood the majority of viewers, confused, curious, and trying to make sense of a situation that kept shifting depending on who was explaining it. And that uncertainty became the fuel for everything that followed. As engagement increased, so did reinterpretation. Short clips were reposted with different captions. Screenshots were shared without full context. And reaction videos started appearing with dramatically different takes on what the pastor actually meant. At this point, the original content was no longer the center of attention. The reaction to the content had become the story. And that shift is what turns a simple moment into a viral cycle. Meanwhile, discussions about Chrisean and her personal life began resurfacing across social media, not based on any new verified information, but because audiences naturally start pulling related names into a trending topic once it gains momentum. This is a common pattern in online culture. Once a narrative begins forming, anything connected to it becomes part of the discussion, whether it belongs there or not. But what often gets lost in that process is accuracy. Because when everything becomes connected, nothing is clearly defined anymore. As the conversation continued, some users began attempting to reconstruct a timeline of events. They gathered old clips, previous interviews, and past moments, trying to create a coherent picture of what might be happening. But instead of clarity, this only added more layers of interpretation. Each new video seemed to introduce a slightly different angle. Each commentary added a new assumption. And each assumption pulled the narrative further away from its original source. Even so, the story continued gaining traction. Not because there was a confirmed development, but because the uncertainty itself was engaging. And that's what makes situations like this spread so quickly online. People aren't just reacting to facts. They're reacting to possibility. What could this mean? Why was it said? Is there more behind it? Those questions travel faster than answers ever do. At the same time, emotional reactions began shaping the tone of the discussion. Some viewers expressed concern, others frustration, and some simply called for more context before conclusions were drawn. But even those calls for clarity became part of the viral cycle because every opinion added another layer of engagement. And engagement is what keeps the story alive. As the situation developed, commentary creators stepped in to break down the moment from different perspectives. Some focused on media interpretation, how a single statement can change meaning when removed from context. Others focused on audience behavior, how quickly speculation forms when information is incomplete. But even these breakdowns couldn't fully stabilize the narrative. Because the core issue remained the same, there was no single confirmed storyline to anchor everything to. Just fragments of interpretation being repeated across platforms. And as those fragments spread, the story slowly transformed into something larger than its original moment. Not necessarily more accurate, just more widespread. And that is where the real shift begins. Because once a conversation reaches this stage, it no longer depends on the original source alone. It depends on how people continue to interpret it, share it, and reshape it. And right now, that process is still unfolding. With more reactions coming in, more breakdowns being uploaded, and more viewers entering the conversation without seeing where it all actually started. And that's exactly where things are about to escalate further. As the conversation continued to spread, the situation entered a much more intense phase online. What had started as interpretation was now turning into division. Different communities across social media were no longer just discussing the pastor's statement. They were actively arguing over what it meant, what it implied, and whether it should have been taken so seriously in the first place. And this is where viral narratives usually reach their tipping point. Because once interpretation becomes debate, the story stops being passive. It becomes reactive. Comment sections across platforms began filling with conflicting opinions. Some users were demanding full context before any judgment was made, emphasizing that short clips can easily distort meaning when removed from their original setting. They pointed out that many viral controversies in the past have followed the same pattern. An isolated moment gets amplified, and the original intent gets lost in repetition. But others were not convinced. For them, the fact that the discussion was happening at all meant something significant had been said. Even without additional proof or confirmation, they believed the attention itself was evidence that the moment carried weight. And that belief kept the cycle of engagement going. Between these two positions, the conversation became less about facts and more about perspective. And that's where online narratives become difficult to stabilize. Because perspective is subjective. As engagement increased, so did reinterpretation. Influencer pages began posting breakdowns analyzing tone, phrasing, and possible implications behind the pastor's remarks. Some focused on language analysis, what was explicitly said versus what could be inferred. Others focused on audience reaction patterns, why certain viewers interpreted the same statement in drastically different ways. But instead of narrowing understanding, these breakdowns expanded the conversation further. Each new analysis introduced another layer of possibility, and each layer pulled the discussion further away from the original moment. Meanwhile, unrelated content involving Chrisean began resurfacing in recommendation feeds, not because it was directly connected, but because algorithmic systems often group related public figures once a topic begins trending. This created an overlap effect where older clips, interviews, and discussions started appearing alongside the current debate. And that overlap gave the illusion of continuity. Even though no new verified developments had occurred, the presence of related content made the situation feel larger, more ongoing, and more complex than it actually was. This is one of the most powerful effects in modern digital media, perceived connection. When multiple pieces of content appear side by side, audiences naturally assume a relationship between them, even if none exists. As the discussion intensified, emotional responses became more visible. Some viewers expressed concern and called for restraint, urging others not to jump to conclusions without full context. Others expressed frustration at how quickly narratives form and spread, especially when children and personal lives are indirectly involved in public conversations. And that emotional layer added even more energy to the cycle. Because emotion drives engagement faster than analysis ever can. At this stage, commentary creators were no longer just explaining the situation, they were dissecting how the situation itself was evolving. Videos began focusing on media literacy, misinformation patterns, and how quickly incomplete information can turn into widely accepted narratives. But even these educational breakdowns couldn't fully stop the momentum. Because the story was no longer dependent on accuracy alone. It was being sustained by attention. And attention is self-reinforcing. The more people talked about it, the more visible it became. The more visible it became, the more people joined the conversation without prior context. And the more people joined, the more fragmented the interpretations became. It was a cycle with no single point of control. And as that cycle continued, the original statement from the pastor gradually faded into the background. It was still referenced, still replayed, still debated, but it was no longer the central focus. Instead, the focus had shifted to something broader. How quickly does meaning change when information spreads faster than verification? That question began appearing more often in discussions, and it reflected a deeper awareness forming among some viewers. People started recognizing that the situation wasn't just about one statement, it was about how digital culture processes statements in general. But even as awareness grew, the narrative itself remained unstable. Because different audiences were still anchored to different interpretations. Some believed the situation was being overblown entirely. Others believed there was more to the story than what had been publicly shared. And many were simply observing, trying to understand how the same content could produce such drastically different reactions. And that divergence is what keeps viral cycles alive. Not agreement, but disagreement. Not clarity, but uncertainty. As the discussion approached its peak, the tone of the internet began to shift again. What had been fast-paced reaction turned into slower reflection. People started revisiting earlier clips with more caution. Context began to matter more in discussions. And some users even started pointing out how easily narratives can form without solid grounding. But even in this more reflective stage, the conversation didn't disappear. It evolved. From reaction to analysis. From analysis to awareness. And that awareness set the stage for the final realization of this entire cycle. Because eventually, every viral moment reaches the same point, when people stop asking what happened and start asking how they believed it so quickly. And that's where the final layer of this situation begins. As the conversation began to slow down, the energy around the situation shifted noticeably. What had been a fast-moving wave of reactions, interpretations, and fragmented opinions started to settle into something more reflective. And in that quieter space, the internet began to do what it often does after a viral cycle peaks. It started reevaluating what actually happened versus what it believed happened. Because once the noise reduces, clarity starts to return. And in this case, the first thing that became clear was the gap between the original moment and the online narrative that formed around it. The pastor's statement, which had triggered the entire discussion, was never a confirmed report of any wrongdoing or new incident. It was a spoken moment that gained attention, then rapidly expanded through clips, reposts, and commentary interpretations. Each layer added something new: tone, analysis, emotional framing, speculation, but very little of it came from additional verified information. And that distinction is important. Because in digital culture, repetition often gets mistaken for confirmation. As more users revisited the original content, a pattern became visible. Many of the strongest reactions had come from edited clips or short excerpts rather than the full context of what was actually said. And when those full versions were reintroduced into the discussion, some interpretations began to soften. Not because opinions disappeared, but because context changed the framing. At the same time, discussions involving Chrisean and her personal life that had been pulled into the conversation began to fade from relevance. What initially appeared as a developing storyline had, upon closer inspection, remained unchanged from any verified standpoint. No new confirmed details had emerged during the viral cycle. No official updates had been released that supported the more dramatic interpretations circulating online. What had changed was perception, not reality. And that realization started to shift the tone of commentary across platforms. Creators who had initially focused on emotional reaction began pivoting toward explanation. Instead of emphasizing drama, they started focusing on how quickly online narratives form when multiple factors align: a recognizable public figure, a vague statement, emotional audiences, and algorithmic amplification. Because when those elements combine, even neutral moments can appear significant. And once something appears significant enough times, it begins to feel real regardless of verification. This is where the broader lesson of the situation becomes visible. Not about the individuals involved, but about the systems surrounding them. Social media does not wait for confirmation. It responds to momentum. And momentum is built through engagement, not accuracy. That means the fastest version of a story is often the one that spreads first, not necessarily the one that is most correct. In this case, a short statement became a trending topic. That topic became a debate. The debate became a narrative. And the narrative became a fragmented version of events that looked far more complex than the original moment ever was. But as the cycle wound down, a sense of correction began to appear. More users started emphasizing the importance of context. Others pointed out how easy it is for public discussions to spiral when incomplete information is amplified. And some even reflected on their own role in sharing or reacting before understanding the full situation. And that reflection matters, because it signals a shift from reaction to awareness. At the center of it all, the actual situation remained far simpler than the viral conversation suggested. A public statement was made. It was interpreted in multiple ways. It spread quickly, and then it was gradually clarified as attention moved on. No confirmed new incident. No verified escalation. No official development tied to the more extreme interpretations that circulated online. Just a viral moment that expanded far beyond its original scope. And that is what makes this case so important in understanding modern digital culture. Because today, stories don't just exist. They evolve in real time based on how audiences interact with them. And once that evolution begins, it can temporarily separate perception from verified information. But it doesn't change the underlying facts. It only changes how they are seen. As the conversation fades, what remains is not a controversy, but a reminder. A reminder of how quickly meaning can shift when context is incomplete, how fast narratives form under pressure, and how important it is to slow down before accepting viral interpretations as reality. And now, as this discussion settles, the internet moves forward again toward the next trending topic, the next clip, the next moment that will go through the same cycle. Because it always does. New story, new reaction, new interpretation, same pattern. And that's where this one leaves off, not with a dramatic conclusion, but with clarity returning after the noise. Before you click away, think about how fast this situation actually moved. One short statement turned into a full online debate. Clips were cut, opinions were added, assumptions were made, and suddenly a single moment felt like a much bigger story than it really was. And by the time people slowed down to check context, the narrative had already taken on a life of its own. That's the reality of the internet right now. Not everything that trends is fully understood. Not everything that gets shared is fully verified. And not every reaction you see represents the full picture behind the story. So the real question is this: how often do we accept a viral narrative before we actually understand where it started? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those situations where different people walked away with completely different interpretations of the same moment. Some saw concern, some saw misunderstanding, and some saw nothing more than online exaggeration. And your perspective matters here, because it shows how differently information can be processed depending on how it's presented. If you found this breakdown helpful, Hit the like button so more people can see the context behind viral stories instead of just the reactions. It helps push content like this to viewers who are constantly seeing headlines, but not always seeing the full picture behind them. And make sure you subscribe with notifications turned on, because stories like this don't stop. Every day, new clips go viral, new interpretations form, and new narratives take shape within hours. The next situation could already be building while you're watching this. Stay aware, stay informed, and don't let fast-moving content replace full understanding.